Welcome again. It's hard to believe we're already well into the third module. You're going to be working with Dr. Spade this week, so I'm going to encourage you again, please. That's a long piece of work, 30 some odd pages. Please skim it. A number of you have backgrounds in other states. Rashawn, if you could think a little bit about what you know about funding in Mississippi. We have another colleague from New York. We have another colleague from Louisiana. If you know anything at all about the funding formulas for higher education in those states, and frankly, our two colleagues who are K-12, if you have any connections or contacts with how funding takes place there, I'm sure Dr. Spade would appreciate your willingness to share some of that information. So, what Chapter 3 really sets out to do, and it does, I think, a very good job, it talks about the purpose, the organization, and the models for budgeting, along with linking it to a planning model of sorts and to the mission, vision, values of the school. I learned a word 100 years ago when I was pretending I could be an English major. It's called a portmanteau term. And some might very well say that's what budgeting is. And I'll give you a couple of reasons why I say that. There were two, I thought, well-made points in the first part of that chapter. The first one was, well, budget has a purpose. What is its purpose? It's to spend resources to achieve specific goals by specific times. Usually it can be a fiscal quarter, it can be a year. If you're talking about the capital budget, it may be 3 or 5 years, just as it might be with a grant budget. But spending to achieve specific goals within a time parameter is very good. Ideally, if you could convince the accountants of it, the other definition I think is very useful, and that simply is that a budget's sole reason for existing is to fulfill educational purposes as they can be phased into financial or fiscal terms. Pretty good stuff. I like that. I did encourage Dr. Spade to please spend some time with you on looking at how mission, vision, and values, first of all, evolve, and how they then are captured in budgets. I've worked with her in many budgeted areas. She's an excellent special needs budget person, which is a subset we'll talk about in a bit within a general operating budget. She is one of the best grant writers I know and has maintained a number of different grant budgets and never, ever got an audit exception, anything that I ever worked with her on. And the other thing that I wish I had some experience with, which she does, when she was in Durham, North Carolina, she was working with a unit of a larger institution that was based some miles away in Rocky Mount, and how she and her colleagues there had fed information into the main campus budget and then got feedback from them and resources from them is really fascinating. I'm sorry I'm not going to be there with you to hear it. Very quickly, just as a reiterative of something you've already heard, the status of most of the kinds of institutions we're looking at is that they are not for profit. There are a few that are. As I've told you about, one of the colleges here in Hagerstown is a for-profit owned by the corporation that owns the Washington Post. So, but most of them are not. There's a useful equation that you always keep in mind when you're talking about budgets. Wants are infinite and resources are finite. So let's talk about some of the things they share with us. One of the things they bring up is this whole issue of the allocation of resources beyond the traditional fiscal year, whatever it may be. A couple things have come up that I've talked with you about before, and I will talk briefly with you again. First of all, fund balances. What do you do with them? Do you allocate them to projects that have merit but were not funded? Coming down to make this tape tonight at the University of Maryland Center, I was listening to the radio. Several programs in Hagerstown City received external funding. They were in the regular operating budget, but received external funding, either state or grant. And a couple of things, they were fortunate, almost unheard of these days, that the projects came in at less than what was anticipated. So what they're doing now is they have $1.2 million to spend before the end of 2012, so they've already started to allocate. The other thing, and I mentioned this to you before, Dr. Spade was as active as I am when in Hagerstown working with this Women's Center. And one of the things that we're working very hard on, we had a budget review again yesterday afternoon. We're trying to get our rainy day fund up to 3 months of operating if, God forbid, something were to happen and all the funding would go away. The state of Maryland, by the way, whenever it has a surplus, not very often recently, has a rainy day fund for those same kinds of reasons. And again, if it's more long range and you want to put money into a particular investment fund, figuring that you can work on it and make it grow, that also depending upon the regulations, if you're private, what your corporate regulations say, and what the Code of Maryland regulations say if you're a public institution in the state of Maryland. Okay, they talk about balancing. How does budgets set up and balance? They talk about a continuum. You have the centralized budget, good process. You don't get quite as much sense of ownership with the stakeholders within the institution, but it does link very well to strategic planning. The decentralized model, which I tried to practice when I was at Hagerstown because I was blessed, along with Dr. Spade, with some very other highly talented individuals. One of the things you have to work on is to constantly train those individuals to understand what accountability really means, what you can and can't do with your funds, and if you need to change something, how you go about it. A couple things that are very critical. A number of types of institutions have to have public hearings on their budgets, brought about by the much overused word in this decade, in the 21st century, transparency. But there are sunshine laws. Our county has to do that if they go beyond constant yield, and I'll discuss constant yield with you if Dr. Spade doesn't have time. Who the audience for these sunshine meetings? Usually it's internal stakeholders, it's clients. For our friends in K-12, those are the ones that are the most concerned because they're the ones whose taxes are raised to meet the changing and increasing needs of K-12 education. And of course you have the public agents, who have whoever's putting money in. If it's a school board, if it's a county commission as with the community colleges, or it's with your own board of trustees that we have here at Morgan. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to leave a lot of this to Dr. Spade because I promised to keep these to 10 minutes. Operating budget. Very critical that whatever role you have, one of your responsibilities is to constantly watch the cash flow so that you don't find yourself with too much money at the end of a particular quarter or not enough, which is a much greater difficulty. Capital, budget, funding, we're going to talk a little bit about that once several of you have had an opportunity to see how it's done where you come from. Large multi-year projects is one of the major uses of a capital budget. Another one, of course, is if you have a particular large piece of equipment that goes beyond a certain set amount, that often becomes a part of the capital budget as well. Okay, auxiliary, we did a great job. I want to thank Coach again for his work helping us understand that. Athletics, certainly we know is part of it. Food service is part of it. Bookstore is part of it. And of course the special fund activities, which are grants and certain kinds of donations. Let's move on and talk about how the accountants like to structure budgets. And if Dr. Spade wants to talk about her familiarity with Maryland, her familiarity with North Carolina, that would be great. You have the cash structuring, which simply books the money when you receive notice that you have it, and it is listed as expensed once you have in writing, even if the dollars aren't actually spent. Once you have put that money in the hands of someone who has a right to spend it. The accrual at the time that it's earned rather than at the time that it is received. And again, the other half of accrual is when do you commit it. Formula budgeting, as they point out in the text, tends to be a lot of what we do in the public sector. It seems to be more desirable. We have others. I'm going to let Dr. Spade talk to some of them. She's had experience with the incremental budgeting, which has to do with the percent of increase. You say to people who are giving you money, you can go up to 2% overall, no more, which means if you have to move funds around, bring your rationale when we have the budget hearing. I would say when you look at limited and performance-based, remember the project we looked at last week, which is the Boston Consulting Group. On the incentive, look at stars and question marks. For the performance-based, look at the dogs. Plan program budgeting may be coming back, mainly because of the much more sophisticated technology that we have. Okay, I'm going to end a little over 10 minutes. I want to talk about a beautiful set of material that you can see on pages 81 through 83. If you look at those models, it'll give you an idea of how this thing really is supposed to play out. Enjoy Dr. Spade. I'm sorry I won't be with you. She's fun to work with.